Welcome everyone to my Deadeye Bonestorm build guide. This build turned out way better than expected. Trial of Chaos and Sekimus are an absolute breeze. It can dish out an impressive 7 to 9 million damage per Bonestorm, making even +4 difficulty pinnacle bosses feel trivial. Now when it comes to mapping, the clear speed is fantastic, thanks to being able to achieve over a 55% movement speed. And with the right tweaks, the build can wipe out entire screens of monsters, and even take down enemies off screen, which enhances survivability and makes the build less reliant on heavy defenses. Also, high density, heavily juiced breaches are no problem, and can even carry multiple players through the runs. If all this sounds interesting, stick around to learn all of the little quirks you need to know to turn a clunky spell into an absolute powerhouse. Alright, so let me explain what Bonestorm is. It's a channeled spell that when clicked, you'll be able to hold and then release it. You'll also notice that you can tap Bonestorm and then immediately be able to walk. However, you'll also notice that all of the bone splinters don't fully accumulate, leaving a lot of bone splinters falling behind you on the ground. We want to be able to accumulate all of those bone splinters while moving. You'll be able to do this by clicking once and releasing, and then clicking again and holding. It'll look something like this. Click, click again, release. Click, click again, release. Next, I want to introduce you to the second mechanic of Bonestorm, which is the power charge mechanic. If you read here, you'll be able to consume power charges to cause a much larger explosion. So we're going to be generating power charges. You'll notice up here at the top left them appearing in blue. And the next time you cast your bone spear, they'll be able to detonate, and that's where all those blue purplish hued explosions are coming from. The way that we are generating charges is by using the bushwhack boots. This makes it so that all of the damage that we do is pinning. Then we use the Combat Frenzy Spirit Gem to make it so that whenever we pin, we generate a charge. And lastly, on our passive tree, we take Resonance to convert those frenzy charges to power charges. Now, whenever we hit an enemy, we'll be generating those power charges. The next thing you should be aware of is that we are a cast on crit build. So if you notice up here at the top left, we'll have a meta energy meter. When this fills up, we'll then cast Detonate Dead on a corpse. It'll explode it, causing massive area effect damage. It'll look something like this. This is really good for being able to clear high density maps and breaches. The last thing you should note is that we have modified our Bonestorm to be able to both fork and chain. This allows us to cast our Bonestorm at maximum distance. It'll hit the ground and then chain 6 meters to the nearest enemy, allowing us to off-screen enemies and making it so we are rarely in any danger. In order to get Bonestorm to fork, we're going to be utilizing the Fork Gem. And to get it to chain, we're going to be using the Ricochet Gem along with passive skill tree points and jewels. Let me demonstrate what this looks like. I will throw the Bonestorm at the ground and it'll kill all the enemies around us. Next, I'll demonstrate the forking mechanic. So I'll throw out their faces and you'll notice that it'll fork everywhere. So the way you're going to want to play this build is to run through the map, constantly charging up your bone spears and then throwing them a max distance. That way, all the enemies that appear before you are already either dead or dying or about to die to explosions. Next, let's go over all of the gem setup. To make Bonestorm channel faster, we're going to be utilizing Scattershot. Scattershot makes it so as we're channeling, it adds 2 additional projectiles per stage instead of the default of 1. This, alongside our Ascendancy, Endless Munitions, gives us a total of 4 projectiles being generated per stage. This makes it so we can reach our full stages in under half a second. Next, we add the Fork Support Gem. This allows us to hit an enemy and then create additional projectiles from those forks. So when we hit an enemy, we generate 2 by default from the fork gem. And then on our skill tree, we take split shot and the node before it, forking projectiles, to have an additional projectile created when we're forking, for a total of 3. Now when you're mapping, you'll notice that some of the bone shards won't actually hit an enemy because it has such a large spread. To circumvent the loss of damage, we want to go ahead and slot in Ricochet. This makes it so that any shards that do not hit an enemy and do not fork have a chance to hit the ground and then chain to the nearest enemy. Ricochet, along with nodes on the passive tree like the Ricochet node and jewels that have additional chance to chain from terrain, makes it so that you will have a high chance of chaining those projectiles whenever they hit the terrain. Next, we want to add some damage to it, so we're going to use the Heft support gem to add a 30% more multiplier to our damage, and then also considered casting for an additional 40% more damage multiplier. You are also able to add Brutality if you would like. However, it is worth noting that if you have any as extra damage on your wand in the form of fire, cold, or lightning, none of that damage will be able to be dealt. And thus I recommend avoiding Brutality because you want the lightning damage to be able to proc shock for a 20% increased damage whenever you hit a target, essentially giving you an additional more multiplier. Next, we have our cast on critical, with Detonate Dead being the triggered spell. To support this, we'll be using Magnified Effect and Spell Echo for an increased area of effect, as well as the additional cast. Impetus to increase the amount of energy we're generating to be able to cast more Detonate Deads. And then finally, Inspiration to reduce the cost of them, as Bonestorm has a tendency to generate a lot of meta energy. And so you'll be casting 5 to 10 Detonate Deads very quickly, draining your mana if you don't have Inspiration on here. For boss fights, we're going to have an additional cast on critical. Because we're not going to have any enemies to use Detonate Dead, we're going to have our cast on critical casting Sniper's Mark. We're going to support this with Ingenuity, reducing the cooldown recovery rate on here. If you notice, with that reduced cooldown recovery, you'll be able to cast 1 Sniper's Mark every 1.5 seconds, essentially matching the time of your Combat Frenzy's ability to generate power charges. Next, we take Combat Frenzy. This is what gives us the ability to generate power charges, and we support that by using Profusion, which gives us an additional 50% chance to grant an additional charge. For defensive layers, we use Grim Feast to essentially double our energy shield. On our second weapon set, we'll be utilizing the Blink tech, and then whenever we fight a boss, we'll be utilizing Eye of Winter to inflict critical weakness, allowing us to have a 100% chance to crit on a boss. The last thing I'll leave you with is during boss fights, you'll notice that Fork won't help you deal any additional damage to a boss, and Scattershot gives you 20% less damage, which is a massive amount of damage loss. So when you're fighting a boss, I recommend increasing the amount of damage you deal to a single target by simply adding Physical Mastery in instead of your Scattershot, and removing Fork as it does nothing, and instead add in Inspiration. This will allow you to do significantly more single target damage. We do, however, keep Ricochet in because we're able to throw the Bonestorm at the ground when we have power charges. They'll explode, dealing damage to the boss, then have a chance to ricochet or chain from the ground back to the boss, hitting the boss a second time, essentially doubling our damage. And that is how we get those big giant 7 million, 9 million damage Bonestorms. And lastly, for bossing, you're going to want to have a Chiming Staff with the Sigil of Power and slot that in with Persistence to give you a higher skill effect duration. Now let's go over our options when gearing. For our main hand, we're going to want to have a wand. In order of importance, you're going to want to have as much critical hit chance for spells as possible, as we are a crit-based build utilizing cast on crit mechanics. Then we're going to want as much physical spell skills as possible, 5 being the maximum. And then as many additional damage modifiers as possible in the form of critical spell damage bonus, increased cast speed, increased spell damage, and any damage as extra, with the lightning damage as extra being the most important, as we want to cast shock on the enemies for an additional 20% damage increase. For our offhand, we're going to want to utilize a focus. With the modifiers being very similar to the wand, we're going to want as much critical hit chance as possible and the most amount of plus the skill levels, which is 2. After that, we'll want as many additional damage modifiers as possible in spell damage, critical spell damage bonus, cast speed, and spell physical damage. Next, we'll talk about the helmet. Ideally, you want a ES-based helmet with increased critical hit chance, as much energy shield as possible, and then fill out your resistances. Having a high ES base allows you to consider Subterfuge Mask on the passive tree. This will give you 800 plus evasion, which is really good, for an additional layer of avoidance. Now, for the body armor and the amulet, we need to consider that the build needs 50 spirit to be able to add cast on crit, detonate dead. So one of these prefixes need to be 50 to spirit. It can either be found on your body armor or on an amulet. With that in mind, what kind of body armor you choose is completely up to you. I've played it using an evasion base, a energy shield base, and the Moria Invictus. As long as you are getting your 50 spirit requirement from either your amulet or your body armor, you're basically just using your body armor as a way to get as much ES or evasion as possible and then filling out your resistances. On your amulet, you're going to want as many +3 to level of your spell skills as possible. This can be projectile skills, as Bonestorm is a projectile, and then as many damaging modifiers as possible in the form of either crit chance or critical damage bonus or increased cast speed. And then for prefixes, anything that'll increase your defenses or rarity of items found is fine. For your ring, you're going to need to get as many attributes as necessary in order to meet the requirement of both Bonestorm, which is 205 int at level 21, and Combat Frenzy at 205 dex at levels 21. Once you've reached your attribute requirements, you're then going to be looking for increased mana regeneration on one ring and cast speed on the other, or some combination of both, because cast speed will allow you to get your Bonestorm off faster, and mana regeneration will allow you to not depend on your mana flask as often. After you got your attribute situated, your cast speed and mana regen, you're going to want to fill out your resistances. And then lastly, on the prefixes, you'll want to prioritize maximum life, then increase rarity of items found, and lastly, any additional stats and a maximum mana. It is recommended that you use an Ingenuity belt to increase the effectiveness of your rings. This helps reaching your attribute requirements much easier, as you can't really get dexterity and intelligence on a belt. You can get strength, but we don't really need strength, so I'd recommend you using an Ingenuity belt here. For boots, the Bushwhack Lizard Scale boots are what allow us to generate power charges, so this is a non-negotiable here. And then finally, for your gloves, I would recommend that you get an ES base, because you're able to roll critical damage bonus to increase the amount of damage that we do, get as much energy shield as possible, and then fill out your resistance. For prefixes, of course, you're going to want to get as much maximum life, but that is kind of a secondary thing. If you primarily want to take advantage of ES and how good Grim Feast is, prioritize getting ES on your pieces. If you'd rather have more evasion for whatever reason, that is a possibility. Like I said, if you are able to get the note on the tree here, a body armor with high ES and ES on your gloves, you will be able to reach over 70% evasion very easily. But just take note that if you do decide to go that route, you're going to be missing the critical damage bonus and the critical hit chance, which is why I recommend going Energy Shield. For charms, it is extremely important that you use a stone charm to make it so that you can't be stunned. While you're casting your Bonestorm, if you get stunned, not only will it cancel the channel, but you'll have to restart the Bonestorm from scratch. In certain scenarios, like Simulacrum, if you're starting to channel your Bonestorm and it gets canceled and you don't unleash the Bonestorm to kill a certain amount of enemies directly around you, what ends up happening is you'll try to queue up a Bonestorm while running away. If they stun you again, you'll get no damage, more mobs will surround you, and they'll eventually stun lock you and you'll die. And lastly, for flasks, you can use a regular health flask. You don't need an Olroth's, but if you have it, go ahead and use it. And then a Melting Maelstrom is highly recommended, as Bonestorm does use a whole lot of mana, so having this helps, but you can use it with just a regular mana flask. Just make sure it has as much mana as possible. And you're going to want to have that mana flask giving you mana after probably your second cast. That way, at least the mana regen is getting you closer to the top as often as possible. You never want to make it so that you try to cast Bonestorm and you can't because you're out of mana. That's when a lot of mobs will get around you and end up killing you. Now let's go over the Ascendancy and the passive tree. To start, I recommend moving up to Projectile Proximity Specialization and then choose any one that you prefer. If you find yourself mapping a lot more than killing bosses, then taking Far Shot probably suits you better. If you kill bosses, I found that I like to be closer to the bosses so I can see their one-shot mechanics and not just die on accident. So I prefer taking Point Blank. After that, you're going to make your way over to Endless Munitions, which is the whole reason why we're playing Deadeye, because we're able to accumulate that additional projectile as we're channeling. After that, you'll want to pick up the increased skill speed and Gathering Tailwinds. This allows us to move faster through the map. And then the last 2 points are kind of up to you. If you'd like to be tankier, take Wind Ward. This is going to give you damage mitigation. If you would rather do bigger damage, you can opt to go Avidity. What this is going to do is give you a 30% chance to gain all 3 of your charges, or maximum charges. By default you have 3. And if you do take Avidity, I recommend you that you explore a few of these nodes here. You can take Frenetic, which gives you an additional 5% chance to gain your maximum number of frenzy charges. It also gives you 1 more, so now you have a 35% chance to gain 4 frenzy charges. If you do play with Frenetic, then you have some additional options in terms of getting more damage and getting more energy shield. So you can opt to play with these energy shield nodes here. Because we're always consuming power charges, you get really good value from here. You also get 1 to your maximum power charges. So now let's go over the passive tree. There's a lot of options, a lot of different ways to build it. So I'll give you the more notable points that you need to get, make some recommendations for some adjustments so you can change it to suit your playstyle. Okay, so let's start at the beginning. When you first start playing Bonestorm, you're going to want to choose if you want more evasion or more energy shield. If you want more evasion, you can pick up early movement speed nodes right at the beginning. If you want to go more ES, then you'll start off by getting more projectile damage early. You're going to want to branch off and then connect it through this way. If you're playing ES, you'll be closer to Preemptive Strike, so you'll probably want to pick this up over here. If you went more evasion route here, you're going to want to pick up Cooked. If you're playing the energy shield route and you missed all these movement speed nodes over here, you can pick up some other movement speed nodes, Step Like the Mist, as well as Pin and Run. This will effectively give you 9% increased movement speed, whereas if you went this route over here, you're only getting the 2, 4, 7, 10. So you're only actually missing 1% movement speed. Whenever you run into jewel slots, you're going to want to grab a Prism of Belief and get a Megalomaniac as soon as you can. On the Prism of Belief, you want as much +3 levels to Bonestorm as possible, 3 being the maximum. And on your Megalomaniac, if possible, you want to grab anything that gives you increased chance to chain from the terrain or increased damage when something triggers. But more importantly, and I think almost mandatory, is the node up here called Cut to the Bone. This makes it so that when we crit, we'll be able to remove a portion of the enemy's armor. This also allows us to inflict bleed, increasing our damage, and gives us physical damage. So I would say this is very important. The next thing we'll talk about is the more important notables, which are going to be getting additional projectiles whenever you fork, getting an increased chance to chain from terrain, and then of course we want to get Resonance. This allows us to transfer our frenzy charges to power charges. Without this, we don't have any explosions on our Bonestorm. And then once we've made our decision whether we're going more evasion or energy shield and how much movement speed we're desired, and we've gotten the chaining and the forking and the resonance, then we can start focusing on damage. So There's a lot of options when it comes to critical hit chance and critical damage. So we've reviewed Cooked over here, but there's also Heart Stopping and Heart Breaking over here. Preemptive Strike over here. Also, if you don't have a ton of gear just yet, you can consider grabbing Damage versus Life and then pathing to First Approach. This is going to give you a considerable amount of damage. This is fantastic for mapping. If you already have enough damage, I would probably refrain from picking these up. Then you want to continue getting more critical hit chance and damage bonus. You can pick them up here, Moment of Truth. You can pick up Critical Exploit. Grab all these clusters with Deadly Force for the Jugular, True Strike. You can pick these Power Charge ones that give you more critical damage bonus. And then you can come up here and pick up Controlling Magic. Those are all of your critical hit and critical damage nodes. After that, we're going to pick up more increased physical damage or increased damage. You can pick up a lot of these nodes here, like Tempered Mind, coming down here into Style Bender, and also Staggering Palm. And then after you pick that up, you can consider finding any other increased damage like Crashing Wave, and then Wasting. For jewels, you're going to want to consider Sapphire Jewels with spell damage, critical hit chance, critical damage bonus, and if you've opted to go the Energy Shield route, pick up Maximum Energy Shield. As there's not a whole lot of options for you over here in the tree, you're going to have to settle for these nodes right over here and possibly these nodes up here if you went up here. And if you want to go Emerald Jewels, consider getting projectile damage, increased damage hits against rare and unique enemies, because that's really what's going to be giving you any type of trouble. All the trash mobs and maps are going to be one-shotting anyways. Getting projectiles have increased chance to chain. Movement speed helps, and of course, increased evasion. And now that you know how the build works, how it plays, and how to build it for yourself, here's a few clips of me running some maps, killing some bosses, doing some +4 Difficulty Xescht and a +4 Simulacrum, so you can get an idea of what the experience is playing the build, unedited, unfiltered, with all of my mistakes. But before I show you that, I just want to say thank you to everybody who's been supporting the channel, liking, subscribing, leaving comments in the bottom. It really helps motivate me to keep creating these type of videos. So thank you so much. And without further ado, roll the clips. If you've gotten this far in the video, I just wanted to say thank you one last time. If you enjoyed the video, please don't forget to like the video, subscribe so you can be notified when I release more build guides and more Path of Exile content. That's all from me. I'll see you in the next one.